Just here.
While Governor Hogan wraps up here, we will continue our live coverage at the U.S. Institute of Peace this morning for a discussion on a new report on preventing violent extremism in developing countries with fragile governments. This event just getting underway.
And we do this by linking research with policy, with training and education, and by supporting and working with partners around the world. Our founding legislation also very specifically directs us to, quote, respond to the nation's need for a full range of effective options in addition to armed capacity that can leash violent extremism and manage international conflict. So as a part of this vision, we have long served as a very powerful nonpartisan platform for bringing people together from across sectors, across political views, to tackle some of the most challenging foreign policy issues that our nation faces. And last year, Congress asked us to do exactly that, and to pull together a task force on extremism in fragile states. So this bipartisan group of 15 foreign policy experts set out to develop new strategies that address the underlying causes of violent extremism in fragile states, places that are plagued by weak institutions, poor governance, and unaddressed grievances, with a focus on the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and the Middle East. We released our final report to Congress earlier this year, and that will be the focus of our conversation today. We have a packed morning with an opportunity to dig into a topic that I believe is getting some important and critical traction, including in the current House and Senate bills that are moving, that are aligned with the report recommendations. Please join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #PreventExtremism. And I would now like to invite my fellow task force members to join me on the stage for our first panel, and also to introduce our moderator, David Ignatius, one of the most thoughtful commentators on critical foreign policy issues. He's a prize-winning columnist for the Washington Post and has been covering the Middle East and the CIA for more than 25 years, as well as the author of best-selling novels. David, over to you.
Thank you to Nancy. It's a pleasure to be here. Truly, there isn't a subject that's more important. If we needed any reminding, this weekend's gruesome news from Sri Lanka tells us that violent extremism is very much with us, that the difficulties of understanding it, being properly forewarned, and dealing with it are as complicated as ever. Let me briefly introduce the members of our panel, and then we'll go to discussion with them. And then we'll turn to the audience and look for you to ask your questions. We've saved 20 minutes to do that, so please be thinking about the questions you'd like to ask. First, Governor Tom Kean, governor of New Jersey, starting in 1981, but really famous to our world of Washington as the co-chair of the 9/11 Commission, an absolutely foundational time for our country as it struggled to think about, understand, respond to that attack. Nancy Lindborg, president of the USIP, was an associate director of USAID running democracy, humanitarian, other key programs, and is now obviously decisive in these operations here. Secretary Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State during the Clinton administration, now head of a very successful consulting firm that bears her name, but involved in almost every good work that I know of. And finally, Steve Hadley, who was National Security Advisor in the Bush 43 administration from 2005 to 2009. Again, Steve is look at a serious discussion group, foreign policy planning exercise, and Steve will be involved in it. Among the many things he does is he's chairman of the USIP Board of Directors. So let me begin with Governor Kean and ask you to set this new task force report in the context of your earlier work with the 9/11 Commission. There's some language in the report that says the CT, counterterrorism approach that grew out of the 9/11 Commission was necessary. All the things that we did as a country were necessary, but they were not sufficient or cost-effective in dealing with the problem that we encountered. So I want to ask you to begin with a simple question. Is there a way in which this new report is kind of a course correction, a mid-course correction from the path you laid forward in the 9/11 Commission report?
Yeah, I don't know whether I'd call it a course correction or a follow-on, because when we did the 9/11 report, we had a number of objectives as defined by the United States Congress. One was, how did it happen? How could this ever happen to the United States? What's the history of it? How did this event happen? And we found in that regard that, we made mistakes all through all of government, really, the background leading 9/11 to happen. And then how do you set up a mechanism in the United States to harden our response so that it couldn't happen again? How do you correct the mistakes that were made before 9/11? And thirdly, what can you do to prevent this kind of thing from ever happening again? On the first two, we were quite successful. We haven't had a major attack. We didn't understand the history of terrorism. We laid out a report which is still authoritative in that regard. But the preventive side was something we didn't really get around to, or at least we didn't follow up on that part of it. So when I was asked to do this with a very wonderful group of bipartisan people, it seemed to me, and it seemed to Lee Hamilton, that this was really a follow-up to our work. This was taking that preventive piece, which never really got acted on, and hopefully to act on it, because there are 10 times more terrorist attacks now than there were at the time we finished the report. So obviously the preventive piece is not working. So that was the way I saw it. I saw it as a follow-up onto our work.
And let me press you just a little bit on what you just said. It's true that the 9/11 Commission report, absolutely foundational document, did talk about the need for preventive work for the kind of long-term, not reactive, but longer-term response to this problem of terrorism. And yet I think we'd all agree that that did not happen sufficiently. So my question is, as we embark on a new effort to emphasize that, what obstructed it in the past, and what do we have to look at very practically and specifically to make it work better now?
Well, I think there was never the government really worked hard on most of our report, and the Congress. And we did establish for the things, the first two recommendations, major recommendations, we did follow through with a framework all through government with the support of the United States Congress. Prevention was sort of down the road. We never really got a handle of it. There were good people in government who did work on prevention. There were agencies of government that were out there in the field doing things, hopefully to prevent the rise of new terrorists in various countries, but it was never an overriding priority. Prevention, for instance, was not mentioned in many government documents. It just wasn't top of the agenda. And I guess what we're saying in this report is it's got to be top of the agenda right now. I mean, that we are in danger with ISIS and that framework, with Islat of al-Qaeda and all of that. We're in danger of allowing this problem to get away from us again, and allowing things to happen which will make this a much less safe world. And eventually, no matter how hard we put our defenses up in this country, if we allow the spread of the terrorist ideology and the terrorist network, then eventually it's going to get here. And there's nothing we can do to prevent it unless we are willing to outreach to the rest of the world, and particularly in these fragile states. And our mandate was particularly to look at these fragile states, because that's where the hotbed and the birth of so much terrorism is.
Nancy, your agency, the USIP, is one of the few in government that very specifically has the mandate to deal with the problems that this report describes. Every day, USIP people, at least as I encounter them, are out in the world dealing with problems of fragility, problems of how to get greater coherence, better governance. Maybe you could tell us what you learned from this work about fragility and give us a couple of success stories and help us see in practical terms what this report could mean if it was really embraced by the whole of our government.
Well, the report very specifically looks at the conditions that exist in fragile states that enable extremism to take root, to recruit others. And if you look at both this report as well as the interim report that was released last 9/11, it describes the key conditions as being a sense of injustice, a sense of unaddressed grievances, a lack of sense by a country's citizens that its government is providing for their needs and services. So in essence, that social contract is broken. That's the definition of fragility. And, you know, it's a spectrum. You can be on many parts of the fragility spectrum, and it can exist at the national or the subnational level. And what we have learned is that the more fragile a place is, the more likely it is to be the common denominator for a host of problems related to violent conflict, civil wars, out-migration, incidents of violent extremism. And we're seeing today in the news that as ISIS mutates into ISIS 2.0, it's popping up in those places that are the most fragile, like DR Congo. They're certainly present now in Afghanistan, and the possibility is that it would spread. So there's both the presence of the ideology, but it's looking at those places of fragility where you want to get ahead of the problem by addressing the core governance issues to create greater resilience to the virus of the ideology taking hold.
Let me ask you to just say a little bit more in practical terms about what that looks like. And I'll preface that with a recollection of my own from Afghanistan. I remember one of the commanders under General Petraeus saying, if you look at areas in Afghanistan where there isn't a local judge or prosecutor to adjudicate disputes, and you look at a map of where the Taliban is strong, it's the same map. Okay, we get it. It's the same map. So they created, in this wonderful American way, the rule of law field force. It had a one-star commanding it, a brilliant general. I remember flying with him to Coast to see the rule of law field force in action. And you couldn't sort of dream up a better way for America to get it and apply the right people. I'm sure in that little kind of village outside of Host, the same, rotten lack of adjudication of disputes continues, and that we didn't fix it. So maybe you could just think a little bit about how, knowing what the problem is for so long, we could actually do better at making a sustainable difference.
Well, the report addresses the importance of having locally led solutions as opposed to parachuting in external forces, that it be a set of solutions that are shared. So there's a shared framework among our defense, diplomacy, and development capabilities that enable us all to point in the same direction as opposed to undercutting each other's efforts. And that we do so in concert with international partners. And there's a piece of it that says a strategic prevention initiative that unshackles a lot of our bureaucracy from the kind of constraints that keep us
This is an activation of the Amber Alert system. We have just